The Invention of Sophie Carter by Samantha Hastings. Prologue. The wheels in the pocket watch turned in never-ending circles. Sophie watched the gears move as if hypnotized until her 10-year-old twin sister, Mariah, nudged her arm. Make Edmund smile again. I'm drawing his mouth now. Sophie dangled Papa's golden pocket watch over her baby brother's bassinet. He cooed and reached for it with his tiny hands. Laughing, Sophie gently touched his dark downy hair. It was so different from her and Mariah's curly red locks. But then, he wasn't their blood relative. Papa and Mama had taken Sophie and Mariah in when their birth mother died, bringing them into this world. Sophie watched Mariah gently sketch Edmund's upper lip onto the paper in the curve of a smile. Mariah had already drawn Edmund's round head, closely set eyes, and his little button nose. Even without a bottom lip, the picture clearly resembled their little brother. "What are you two doing to my baby?" Mama snapped as she entered the room, looming over Sophie and Mariah with an accusing look on her face. She had dark circles around her brown eyes, looking as if she hadn't slept since Papa left for the islands 2 weeks before. Sophie stepped back, away from the bassinet and her mother. She was always the one Mama accused of wrongdoing. Mariah held up her sketch. "I was only drawing a picture of Edmund, and Sophie was helping me by making him smile," she explained. "Show her, Sophie. Show her how Edmund laughs." Sophie reluctantly dangled the pocket watch by its chain over the bassinet again, and Edmund smiled up at them. Mama lifted her hand. Sophie shrunk away from her, clutching Papa's pocket watch against her chest. She wished he hadn't gone on another voyage, leaving her with a foster mother who didn't love her, or even like her. Mama only cared for Mariah, and now for baby Edmund. "I won't hold it over him if you don't want me to," Sophie said quickly. "I didn't mean to do anything wrong." "Give me Captain Trenton's watch," Mama said, holding out her hand. Sophie clutched the golden pocket watch even tighter in her little hands and shook her head. "Papa gave it to me so that I could count the seconds until he returned from his voyage. Captain Trenton's pocket watch is not a toy. It's very valuable. Now, give it to me." "It belongs to Papa. It belongs to me," Mama said sharply. Edmund began to cry. "I'll give it back to Papa," Sophie pleaded, but Mama wrenched it out of her hands. "Go to your room and help Nurse pack your things," Mama said, picking up Edmund, whose cries had become loud wails. "You are leaving." "Are we going to meet Papa?" Mariah asked. "You're going to Lyme Regis to stay with Mr. and Mrs. Ellis," Mama said, bouncing her crying baby. "Mr. Ellis was a friend of your dead father's. And since your aunt, Lady Bentley, refuses to have anything to do with you, there is nowhere else to send you." "How long are we going to stay with them?" Sophie asked. "Pack all your clothes and ask no more questions." They'd never visited anyone before without Mama or Papa. Something was not right about this visit. Sophie could feel it. But before she could ask another question, Mariah took her hand and gently led her from the room. They found Nurse in their bedroom, already packing their things into one large trunk. "What can we do to help?" Mariah asked. A tear slid down Nurse's red cheek, and she placed a soft hand on both of their faces. "Nothing, my dear girls. The carriage will be here soon." "Are you coming with us?" Sophie asked. Nurse shook her head, spilling more tears. "I have to stay with Edmund, but you'll be good girls though, won't you?" "I'm scared," Mariah said. Nurse turned and picked up Mariah's doll with the pink ribbons in its hair and handed it to Mariah. "Hug Lydia if you're scared, dear, and you won't be alone. You have Sophie." Sophie was scared too, but she didn't dare admit it. Nurse picked up Sophie's identical toy. "I suppose you don't want to bring Diana along." You know I don't like dolls. How about hugs? Nurse asked, opening her arms. Sophie stepped into them, breathing in the familiar scent of starched linen. Mariah joined the embrace, and for a moment everything felt right again, until they heard carriage wheels on the pavement in front of their house. Sophie broke away from Nurse to look out the window. The carriage driver dumped down from his perch onto the cobblestone road. Grab your bonnets, girls, Nurse said as she closed their trunk. The sound had a finality to it. Mariah started to cry. Sophie took her hand and helped her sister put on her bonnet and coat. Nurse carried the trunk down the stairs, where Mamma stood by the front door, holding it open. The girls followed Nurse out to the street, where the driver took the trunk and secured it to the back of the carriage. Pulling her hand from Sophie's, Mariah threw her arms around Mamma's middle. Mamma's face softened for only a moment before she said, "Get into the carriage, Mariah." Sophie couldn't leave home without Papa's pocket watch. How was she supposed to tell time without it? And how was she to know how long it would be until Papa would return for her? "I forgot Diana," she lied, darting back into the house. Instead of heading for her bedroom, she ran to the drawing room. There was a loose brick on the fireplace where she knew Mamma hid her precious pearl necklace. Sophie pulled out the brick and the box behind it. Inside, sitting on top of the pearls, was Papa's pocket watch. Sophie grabbed it and shoved it in her pocket, then pushed the box back into its secret spot and replaced the brick. Taking the stairs by twos, she dashed to her room and grabbed the doll. Panting, Sophie ran out of the house. She hugged Nurse one last time before climbing onto the carriage seat beside Mariah, who was clutching her own doll tightly. The driver closed the door and tipped his hat to Mamma. She didn't say a word, not to him or her foster daughters. The carriage started forward, and Sophie glanced one last time out the window. Nurse had tears on her face, but Mamma looked grimly satisfied. Sophie reached her hand inside her pocket and felt the watch and its linked golden chain. She rubbed her thumb over and over the scroll decoration on the front of it. Papa would come for his pocket watch. He would come for her and Mariah. After several hours, the carriage stopped in front of a narrow row house with peeling red paint. There was a sign in the front window that read, "Clocks and Repairs." Mariah clutched her doll with one hand and Sophie's hand with the other. She inched closer to her twin, feeling less afraid with her near. "Why did the driver bring us to a clock stop?" Mariah asked. "Do you think there's been some mistake?" Before her sister could answer, the driver opened the door and held out his hand to Sophie. He helped Mariah out next and then untied their trunk from the back of the carriage. He placed it in front of the door to the clock shop and knocked 3 times. Mariah was afraid he would leave them, but he waited until a woman answered the door. She was younger than Mamma, but her face was already harshly lined. Her light hair was combed back in a severe bun, and her eyes were a color between gray and blue. The woman's dress was dark and very worn, nothing like the bright silk gowns that their Mamma wore. "Mrs. Ellis," the driver said, and tipped his hat to her, before smiling reassuringly at Mariah and Sophie. Mariah attentively returned his smile and looked eagerly up at Mrs. Ellis. "Thank you for inviting us to stay." Mrs. Ellis laughed. The harsh sound was grating to Mariah's ears. "You weren't invited. The Trentons don't want you no more, and my husband is the only person alive foolish enough to take in 2 strangers." Mariah looked at Sophie, who was hugging her doll for the first time ever. She looked just as scared as Mariah felt. "Are you 2 witless?" Mrs. Ellis asked. "No, ma'am," Sophie said. "Then grab your trunk and come in," Mrs. Ellis said. "I don't have all day to stand in my doorway." Mariah released Sophie's hand, and they each took a handle of the trunk to carry it into the house. They walked through the shop that had only 5 clocks on display, a cluttered table, and a man with a wooden leg sleeping in a chair. He wore a sailor's coat and looked like a rumpled pirate. A door from the shop led to a staircase and a kitchen, which was the only other room on the main floor of the house. She saw a table with dirty dishes on it and 4 chairs that did not match. They set their trunk on the floor, unsure what to do with it. Maria wrinkled her nose. Something smelled very unpleasant. She looked behind the door and saw 2 dirty little girls eyeing her doll, Lydia, in wonder. Maria guessed the oldest girl was 3 and the younger girl about a year old. Her nappy was probably dirty. They reminded Maria of Edmund, and she wished she had thought to bring the sketch of him with her. "Should we take the trunk to our room?" Maria asked. "There's a mattress in the attic you can share for now, and no more of your fancy airs," Mrs. Ellis said, spitting on the already dirty floor. "You're a pair of charity cases that ought to be thrown on the parish, and that's exactly what I'll do if you give me any trouble. Now tell me you're grateful to me for taking you in when no one else wanted you." "Thank you, Mrs. Ellis, for taking us in," Maria said, then nudged Sophie with her elbow. "Thank you," her sister muttered. Mrs. Ellis smiled, and Maria noticed that her 2 front teeth were gray. "I can tell by your pretty little hands that you've never done a day's work. Well, that'll change right now. You," she barked, pointing at Maria, "take care of my girls. And you," she pointed to Sophie, "scrub the kitchen. There's a shared pump with a bucket in the back. I'm going to take your trunk to the pawn shop and see what your things will fetch. Not nearly enough to pay for your keep, I reckon. Now hand over your fancy dolls." Maria's arm tightened around Lydia. She didn't want another thing she loved taken away from her. She glanced at Mrs. Ellis's dirty children, who were holding on to her skirt. "Might we give our dolls to your daughters?" Sophie immediately handed her unwanted doll to the older girl. It was no sacrifice for her. The little girl's face lit up, and Maria felt a twinge of pity for her. Mrs. Ellis held out her hand for Maria's doll. Maria hugged Lydia one last time and handed it to her. Mrs. Ellis then ripped Sophie's doll out of her daughter's hand. "They need food." Both little girls began to cry. Maria's already broken heart cracked further for these unloved little girls, but Mrs. Ellis appeared unmoved. "The big one is Agnes and the baby is Sarah," Mrs. Ellis said. "I want them both cleaned up by the time I return." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Ellis set the dolls on top of the trunk and carried them both out the kitchen door. Maria picked up the crying baby and felt wetness on her hand. The smell up close was unbearable. She never changed a nappy before, but she'd watched Nurse change Edmund. It couldn't be that difficult, could it? "I better start cleaning the kitchen," Sophie said, her hand in her pocket. She was clearly hiding something, which was smart if she wanted to keep it. Maria watched her walk out the back door and pick up a bucket to fetch water. Maria was going to need water too, if she was going to clean up the little girls. The rest of the afternoon and evening passed in a blur for Maria. Her hands ached from scrubbing out the dirty nappies, and the small bowl of soup she had eaten for dinner did not even begin to curb her hunger. When they were finally sent to bed for the night, she took Sophie's hand, and together they climbed the stairs, up the ladder, and into the attic. They had no gas lamp or candle, so they had to feel their way along in the dark. Finally, Maria tucked a lumpy mattress on the floor with a thin blanket on it. Both she and Sophie lay on it, snuggled close together for warmth. She heard the scurrying of little paws and forced herself to hold in her scream. "Do you think that was a mouse?" "Or a rat," Sophie said, yawning. "I'm too tired to care." "Do you think it's true?" "What?" "What Mrs. Ellis said," Maria whispered. "That Mama and Papa don't want us anymore." Sophie squeezed Maria's hand. "Our parents are dead, and the Trentons aren't our family." Maria shook her head. She was sure that Mama and Papa loved her and Sophie. They'd taken care of them for 10 years. She pictured their warm, beautiful brick house with 5 servants, not including Nurse. Mama and Papa sitting on opposite ends of the dinner table, eating beef Wellington, bread, and then pudding. Mariah could almost taste the pudding. Her hungry stomach made a gurgling noise it had never made before. "We are their daughters. They'll come for us," Mariah said. "There's been some sort of mistake." She heard Sophie shake her head. "They have a son of their own now. They don't need foster daughters anymore." Tears began to leak from Mariah's eyes. "Then we're all on our own?" "You have me, and I have you," Sophie whispered. She kissed Mariah's wet cheek. "We don't need anyone else."